Live from London, this is BBC News. Iran's supreme leader breaks his silence, saying the US gained nothing from striking his country's nuclear sites and the attack was simply showmanship from Donald Trump. The US Defense Secretary insists the military operation was an historic success.
Decimating, choose your word, obliterating, destroying Iran's nuclear capabilities.
I'm Mark Lowen, live in Tel Aviv. We'll have more on Iran and also on Gaza, where local rescuers say 56 people there were killed today.
Our other headlines: the UK government appears set to make some concessions on its welfare bill after more than 120 Labour MPs signalled they were ready to rebel. We'll speak live to two of them. And workers started on a controversial project to create human DNA from scratch. Supporters say it could help cure countless diseases. Critics argue it could open the door to genetically enhanced humans. Hello and welcome to today's Verified Live. The US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has described America's military strikes against Iran's nuclear program as historically successful. Speaking at a news conference in Washington, he mounted a robust and occasionally angry defense of the mission. He also attacked sections of the media for, in his words, fawning over early intelligence reports on the strikes and suggesting they showed the US attacks had limited impact. Well, all of that comes after Iran's supreme leader appeared on state TV claiming victory over Israel and saying the US attacks failed to achieve anything significant. More on that here in a moment or two. First, though, here's more of what Pete Hegseth has been saying.
President Trump directed the most complex and secretive military operation in history, and it was a resounding success, resulting in a ceasefire agreement and the end of the 12-day war. There's been a lot of discussion about what happened and what didn't happen. Step back for a second. Because of decisive military action, President Trump created the conditions to end the war, decimating, choose your word, obliterating, destroying Iran's nuclear capabilities.
Well, Iran's supreme leader made his first appearance on state TV since the 12-day war. He said Donald Trump had exaggerated the impact of America's strikes on their nuclear facilities.
The President of the United States exaggerated events in unusual ways, and it turns out he needed this exaggeration. Anyone who's heard these words has understood there is another truth behind them. The US has failed to take action and has not achieved their intended objective.
Well, let's speak live to Mark Lowen, who's in Tel Aviv for us. And Mark, confirmation, I suppose, firstly, the Supreme Leader is still alive after this 12-day war, but very strident in terms of what he was saying, as much, I suppose, for the internal audience as to the external one.
Yeah, I think so, Matthew. I mean, a diametrically opposite view and portrayal of the impact of the American strikes to that presented from Israel and the US, as perhaps you would expect. I mean, very defiant for an internal audience, I'm sure. But would Iranians really buy it? That is the question. There are murmurs clearly of dissent at the top of the Iranian regime. Bear in mind, you know, the nuclear program that has been built over the last 30 years has cost Iran hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of sanctions. Now there's been this 12-day war. And so will there be kind of an attempt at some kind of dissent within the Iranian regime? And yet there are still doubts that persist over the extent of the damage to Iran's nuclear program, perhaps beyond its nuclear facility, especially given the fact that there are rumors that Iran has squirreled away some amounts of highly enriched uranium. There are now reports that the country will perhaps stop cooperating with the UN nuclear watchdog, the IAEA. And so, given all of that, what room is there still for a return to the negotiating table? Donald Trump said yesterday that there could be talks next week between the US and Iran, but given the amount of mistrust and given the doubts that there are still about where Iran's nuclear program go from there, is there actual trust at all? And is there any room at all for a return to diplomacy?
Mark, thanks very much for now. We'll have more from Mark later in this half hour on the developments in Gaza. But let's go back to the US Defense Secretary. He was speaking alongside the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane. He said he wasn't going to mark his own homework, but the massive bombs had hit their targets and their explosions had been seen. Have a listen.
The weapons functioned as designed, meaning they exploded. And we know this through other means, intelligence means that we have that were visibly, we were visibly able to see them. And we know that the trailing jets saw the first weapons function, and the pilots stated, quote, "This was the brightest explosion that I've ever seen. It literally looked like daylight."
Well, let's speak to our North America correspondent, Nomia Iqbal. And Nomia, it's worth saying right at the start, because I was listening to the US Defense Secretary, it was another extraordinary rant aimed at the media simply for posing sober questions. And I suppose we shouldn't normalise that. But away from that, in terms of the content of what we heard, both from the chair of the Joint Chiefs and from the Defence Secretary, summarise what the thrust of what they're saying was.
Well, we certainly got more details about the attack from General Kane. He showed videos in which you could see that the entrance to the Fordo sites had been destroyed. And you know, that was something we hadn't seen before. But that crucial question of Iran's nuclear capabilities and how far had they been set back, has the US done irreparable damage, that wasn't answered at all. I mean, General Kane focused very much on the logistics of the operation and the military story, telling us exactly what happened, including evacuating Americans from the base in Qatar, which experienced retaliatory strikes from Iran. Whereas Pete Hegseth, yes, he very much focused his anger on the press. I think he was pretty insulting. He scowled often at reporters and accused them of fawning over this leaked intelligence report, which came from his own agency, by the way, which he said was low confidence, preferring to cite everyone else's intelligence but that report. And it was staggering in the sense that reporters are just doing their job, simply asking that question, which everyone wants answered, is how far has Iran's nuclear sites been set back? But we didn't get an answer to that at all. And I think the way the administration certainly seems to be looking at it is by questioning the narrative. The press is accused of not being patriotic enough, not being supportive of American soldiers. But that isn't the case at all, because, you know, just to wrap up, if it turns out that Iran's nuclear sites haven't been set back, haven't been destroyed to the extent that the Americans wanted, the other question is, will the US have to go back in? Will the US then get dragged further into this conflict, which is, of course, the very thing that President Trump has constantly said he doesn't want?
And of course, the Supreme Leader of Iran addressed exactly that if there were further US strikes. In terms of those other comments about Donald Trump, showmanship, he said, exaggerating the damage done to Iran's nuclear sites, all of that, it is likely to needle the president, isn't it?
It will, and the Ayatollah also said that ultimately this is about Iran surrendering and regime change and what have you. And Donald Trump has denied that it's that, although he put up this post saying something about regime change, and it kind of caused confusion. But there is still a plan for the US to have talks with Iran at some point next week. We don't know exactly when they will take place or even where they will take place. We know that the Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, Mr. Trump's man, who goes into these conflicts to try and resolve them, is on standby, basically to fly anywhere he needs to fly to. And the US doesn't want Oman to be involved. They've usually been the sort of the go-between. The US has said they want to talk to the Iranian regime directly.
Nomia Iqbal, live for us there in Washington. Thanks very much for that. Well, plenty more on that story coming up on today's programme. Let's turn to that politics story here in the UK, because it's been dominating for the last 2 or 3 days. Downing Street is now saying they are in talks with Labour MPs as they try to head off that growing rebellion over their welfare reforms. More than 120 Labour backbenchers have signed an amendment calling for the proposals to be scrapped. The government has confirmed a vote on those planned changes will go ahead next Tuesday despite this ongoing row. Jack Fenwick has more from Westminster.
The Prime Minister had hoped to spend the day discussing his new trade strategy. Instead, the epic row about his plans to cut disability benefits rumbles on. Overnight, the list of Labour rebels who want his welfare reforms to be scrapped grew again. 162 MPs have now signed the amendment, 126 of them Labour. But after days of ministers saying they'd hold firm, look at how the tone at the top of government has changed.
Good afternoon.
Yesterday, the Prime Minister wasn't budging.
Are there plenty of people and noises off? Yes, of course. There always are, there always have been, there always will be. But the important thing is to focus on the change that we want to bring about.
Those comments angered backbench MPs even further.
Talking about his MPs, his colleagues, as noises off is partly why he's in the problems he's in. Noises off.
And this morning, Downing Street has confirmed it's in talks with the rebels about possible changes to the welfare policies.
All colleagues want to get this right, and so do I. We want to see reform implemented with Labour values of fairness. That conversation will continue in the coming days so we can begin making change together on Tuesday.
With 126 of his own MPs all openly undermining his authority, his government is incapable of making even the smallest changes to bring down the cost of our ever-expanding welfare bill.
A Number 10 source told the BBC that delivering fundamental change isn't easy. The welfare system's broken and that it's fair and responsible to fix it. But it's looking increasingly likely that concessions will be made before Tuesday's crucial vote. It's not yet clear what Number 10 will offer to try to stave off this rebellion. One potential option could be to change the new eligibility for people receiving the personal independence payment. What clearly is the case is that the negotiations this afternoon are far from over. One Labour rebel told me that Number 10's opening gambit had been too vague and that a compromise was far from being reached yet. That frustration from the rebels was evident in Parliament this morning.
We have spoken to our constituents and organisations representing disabled people who reject the bill because it will cause harm to disabled people and their voices have not been heard.
When they say cut back, we say...
Those unhappy with the cuts don't simply want a tweak to the plans. They say too many people will be pushed into poverty and want to see wholesale change. The problem now for the government is that any big concessions they offer would likely blow a huge hole in the Chancellor's wider spending plans.
That latest from Westminster. Let's talk to two of those potential Labour rebels, Rachel Maskell and Kat Eccles, and welcome both of you to the programme. Rachel, let me start with you and I'll ask the same question to Kat. Just tell me briefly why you're prepared to oppose the government on this, potentially rebel.
Because I'm speaking up for my constituents. I've met with disabled people. They've shared their stories and about the way that this legislation will not only put a huge hole in their budgets already living in poverty, but also will cause psychological harm. I've tragically had people tell me already these discussions have set back their mental health. And tragically for some, they just don't think they've got the mental resilience to get through this. We know that disabled people would work if they could work, but many people can't, and we need to look after them. They're Labour values. That's why our party is in Parliament at all. And of course, it's really important that Labour MPs stand up for those values and stand up for their constituents.
Kat Eccles, the same question to you.
I mean, I would echo absolutely everything that Rachel has just said. I've heard similar terrible, tragic stories from my constituents, but equally, there's a whole load of people who do work, disabled people who are in work, thanks to their personal independence payments. And ministers and Secretary of State have absolutely failed to provide me with any reassurance of what will happen to those people if they can't meet the new 4-point criteria, because a lot of them don't meet that criteria currently. And if they don't get their payments, they may not be able to stay in work. They may not be able to pay their bills and will then become a burden on the state. So I can't see how we're helping people into work when other people may well be pushed out of it.
Let me quote to you what the Prime Minister said today. He talked about doing this with, quote, Labour values. He's also talked in the last few days, you heard it in the report, about noises off. That's how he's described some of the MPs. There have been briefings that have been talking about they have to do this because it's the morally right thing to do. When you hear all of that, Kat, what do you think?
I think it's insulting to our values. How it might be a moral case that we need to find a saving, but I think there's other ways that those savings could be found that don't involve taking money off people before we've got essential support in place for them.
Rachel, let me bring you back in, because do you get the sense that backbenchers sense an element of weakness within Keir Starmer, bruised by those local elections, bruised by recent polling, a U-turn on winter fuel payments, even talk if he lost this vote, whether it's the beginning of the end for him or Rachel Reeves. Is that partly what is behind backbenchers being pretty determined to actually see this through?
No, we are really deeply concerned for our constituents, and that's why we are speaking up, and that's why we are very determined. We cannot see, it's a brutal bill, and we cannot see how there can be concessions to the bill. Clause 1, putting up the standard rate of universal credit, we will support, but the rest of the bill needs to be ditched. And I encourage the government to withdraw this piece of legislation, and instead next Tuesday let's have a debate about the real needs and support that disabled people need. But I think what is most abhorrent in this whole debate, when talking about noises off, we're representing our constituents, and it's a real insult to disabled people to say that their noise is off. These are real lives, and we care for these precious lives, and that's why we will vote down this bill.
Kat, a final thought to you, because you will know what the government has said on this, the need to cut the welfare bill, which is spiralling. They are saying that billions of pounds will be put into helping people back into work. We know that is the government position, but we know now that there are talks going on. There are talks, indications perhaps there'll be concessions. Are concessions enough, or do you reflect what Rachel has just said, that actually the best course of action here is to simply pause on this, do much more work with disabled groups to actually find a way of making the reforms that work for government and work for those groups as well?
Absolutely. I think we need to be designing a PIP system that's radical and really works for disabled people, because what my constituents are telling me and what we've heard from people all over the country is that PIPs never worked for them, and actually the whole process is demeaning, dehumanising and undignified. So I think we really need to be looking at that process and making sure it works for people. And on a final point as well, I'm really baffled why we are combining the conversation about disabled people who need desperate support and healthy, able-bodied people who are economically inactive. These are hugely different groups of people that do not belong necessarily in the same conversation. So this bill is deeply flawed, and I think we need to hit pause on it and just look at this again in the autumn.
Rachel, just 20 seconds if you would. Do you think the penny has dropped in Downing Street on this?
Well, I sincerely hope it is, because I feel that if government continue to be obstinate and push forward, it's not the vote in Parliament that they should be concerned about. It will be the next vote in the country.
There we have to leave it. Rachel Maskell, thanks for your time. Thanks to Kat Eccles for your time. And we, of course, follow it over the next crucial days, and perhaps we'll speak again. But thanks so much for joining us live on the programme. Around the world and across the UK, you are watching BBC News. Welcome back to today's Verified Live, and let's go back to the Middle East and back to Mark Lowen, because earlier we were talking, Mark, to you about Iran, but Gaza now. We've been receiving reports of many people killed today, and also in the West Bank of clashes between Palestinians and settlers. So bring us right up to date, the latest on those elements.
Yeah, indeed, Matthew. The ceasefire with Iran might be holding, but the unrest and violence continue in both parts of the Palestinian territories. In the occupied West Bank, 3 Palestinians were shot dead by Israeli settlers who attacked a village called Kafr Malik near Ramallah. Our correspondent Wira Davis has been there. Wira, I understand you've now moved to another part of the West Bank where there's also been unrest. Just talk us through both incidents today.
Yeah, well, look, there's been sporadic violence across the West Bank in recent weeks, even months. Obviously not as highlighted or as obviously damaging as perhaps what is going on in Gaza, but nonetheless, ever since that war in Gaza, there's been increasing violence here in the occupied West Bank. I'm now outside the village of Turmus Aya. You've got a Palestinian village in the near background, and in the far background, there's a Jewish settlement, and there have been clashes between settlers from the settlement and from various Jewish outposts coming down and setting fire to cars and buildings in these villages. In the village just up the road where we've just come from, called Kafr Malik, 3 young men were shot and killed last night after clashes between settlers who'd come down with Molotov cocktails and tried to set fire to cars and houses. At some point, those settlers were backed up by the IDF, the Israeli army. They fired live rounds towards the village and 3 young men were killed. Now, the Israeli army says they did that after receiving stones and gunfire from within the village. Villagers deny categorically that they fired. They said they did defend their houses with stones and whatever they could have to hand after they were being set alight by settlers. Earlier in the week in the same village, Kafr Malik, a 13-year-old boy was also killed, shot reportedly by an Israeli soldier. Both incidents are being investigated, say the IDF. But it's an example of the increasing tension and violence in the occupied West Bank. More than 900 people have been killed here in Israeli military activity since the start of the Gaza war. 35 Israelis have also been killed in violence here in the West Bank. Settlers are feeling increasingly emboldened. Only last month, the Israeli government approved the building of 22 new settlements. Those settlements are, of course, regarded as illegal under international law because they're being built on occupied Palestinian land. But Israeli government ministers, particularly those on the far right, often support the actions of settlers and support the ultimate goal of settlers, which is to annex the Palestinian West Bank.
Wira Davis in the West Bank, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's move to Gaza now, because the Hamas-controlled civil defense agency there say that 56 people have been killed there since yesterday. Among them, a spokesperson said 4 of those were waiting to collect aid. 9 of the victims were in a school in Gaza City hosting those displaced by the conflict. Israel is yet to comment. Well, let's speak to Ghada Al-Haddad, Media and Communications Officer for Oxfam. She's in Deir al-Balah in Gaza. Ghada, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. How would you describe the situation on the ground in Gaza right now?
Thank you so much for having me. Right now, life in Gaza is defined by survival. Just a few hours ago, an Israeli airstrike hit in the middle of Deir al-Balah, a few kilometers away from where I am right now, claiming the lives of 17 people all at once and leaving others being injured. We are living under unimaginable conditions. Many people in Gaza are without homes right now, without clean water, without electricity, and without access to food. Families are crowded in shelters or in makeshift tent camps with no privacy, with no sanitation, and with no safety. And the threat of Israeli airstrikes and bombing is constant. And even the humanitarian aid is either militarized or blocked from getting into the Gaza Strip. What is happening in Gaza right now is not any crisis. It's a manufactured humanitarian catastrophe. People are starving. People are approaching us at Oxfam asking for food. Hospitals are overwhelmed with injuries, or they are non-functional, and the children are starving, and children are not able to go to school. And every day in Gaza is just trying to stay alive, or making the best to stay alive and not being hit by an Israeli airstrike or any bombardment.
Meanwhile, Gaza, the Israeli authorities say that they are blocking any entry of aid for another 2 days to try to stop Hamas from looting aid, which is what they accuse Hamas of doing. Are you seeing another aid blockade now by Israel?
Since the beginning of the war in Gaza, Israel has used food as a weapon of war. Israel has blocked the food entry into the Gaza Strip. It blocked the food aid into the Gaza Strip, and it used starvation as a policy and as a tactic of war in the Gaza Strip. So that's why people are starving. Most of the people in the Gaza Strip, according to IBC reports, face acute malnutrition due to the lack of food supplies in the Gaza Strip. And adding to this, there are no agricultural or no sufficient agricultural lands in the Gaza Strip because they are bombed during Israeli incursions or during Israeli airstrikes. So Palestinians are not allowed to get food aids from abroad, and they are not allowed to produce their own food. We at Oxfam have hundreds of aid trucks stuck at our warehouses in neighbor countries, in Jordan and in Cairo, but we are not able to bring them here to Gaza. And this is not the case for Oxfam only, but it's also the case for many INGOs, and it is also the case for many UN agencies. So this means this is a deprivation of the Palestinian. This is also a breach of international humanitarian law, where Israel as a occupying power.
Gadal Haddad, I'm going to have to jump in because we are running out of time, but thank you very much indeed. Matthew, back to you in London.
Mark, thanks very much. More from Mark in the region in the next little while. Here on the programme coming up, I'll be in the newsroom assessing what we've heard from the US Defence Secretary, talking to Mikey Kay from the Security Brief. We'll also get the latest from BBC Persian after Iran's Supreme Leader making that first TV appearance. So we'll have analysis on both of those major elements. Those are main planks of stories that we're following here on BBC News.